They told her not to do it, that no one touches the court. Not now, not ever. But that morning, as the city shook off its silence, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked through the Capitol alone. No entourage, no cameras, no fanfare. Just a folder in her hand and a storm in her chest. Inside that folder was something unheard of in modern politics. A motion to impeach a sitting Supreme Court justice for ethics violations too large to ignore and too long protected by silence. The halls whispered, the system tensed, and for the first time in decades, the court, untouchable, eternal, felt something it hadn't known in years. Pressure? This story is a dramatized retelling inspired by real public debates and real public courage. While the events are fictional, the emotions, the questions, and the need for accountability, they are real. Because sometimes, even if the walls don't fall, they tremble. Softened, emotionally resonant version. It was late. The kind of late where even Capitol Hill forgets its own echo. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez pushed open the office door with her shoulder, one hand balancing a takeout container, the other holding her phone with half a thought still lingering on an unread message. She wasn't planning to return tonight, but something about unfinished thoughts and a stubborn habit of needing closure had pulled her back. The lights were off. Just the faint golden glow from the hallway spilled across her desk like a half-open secret. She stepped in, expecting the familiar stillness, but something caught her eye. Centered neatly on the desk was a brown envelope, not delivered with the usual mail pile, not stamped, not marked official, just there, waiting. With one word written on top in tidy block letters, private. She frowned, gently setting down her things. Her fingers hovered over the envelope for a beat too long, as if it might reveal its intentions before she opened it. It didn't. Carefully, she pulled the flap open. Inside, a thick stack of papers shifted quietly. Photographs, printed receipts, what looked like travel records. Some of the names jumped out immediately. One in particular, a Supreme Court justice, currently serving. She turned the pages slowly now. Hotel bookings at luxury resorts, jet itineraries, restaurant bills totaling more than most families spend in a month. None of this matched public disclosures. None of this should have gone unseen. She sat down. At the bottom of the stack, a small yellow sticky note clung to the last page. 6 words, soft pencil, no signature. Use it if you dare. She stared at it longer than she meant to. No introduction, no context. Just an open invitation or a warning. It was hard to tell. The clock on the wall ticked softly behind her. The room, though empty, felt less still now. The kind of quiet that leans in, waiting for what you'll do next. She looked back at the photos. Some were recent. Others dated back several years. This wasn't a one-time oversight. It looked like a pattern. And if the pattern was true, then it raised a different kind of question. Not just what happened, but how many people knew and stayed quiet. She leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. A deep breath filled the silence, followed by another she didn't realize she was holding. Her phone vibrated. A message from a staffer. Don't forget, judiciary briefing is at 9 a.m. Ordinary words, but suddenly they felt heavier. What do you do when the evidence on your desk touches the part of government that's supposed to be above suspicion? Who do you tell when telling the truth means standing alone? She turned the sticky note over. Nothing on the back. No answers there either. Walking slowly to the window, she looked out over the Capitol grounds. Empty, lit in soft amber. Somewhere within those walls, the man in these documents was finishing his day, maybe laughing over a glass of wine, maybe unaware that something had shifted, or maybe very aware. She didn't speak aloud, but her thoughts felt solid, like stones dropping into deep water. You weren't supposed to give me this, she thought. But now that you have, I can't pretend I didn't see it. Behind her, the envelope sat quietly on the desk. The sticky note curled ever so slightly, as if it, too, was holding its breath. She didn't go straight to bed that night. Back at her apartment, the lights stayed dim. Just the under-cabinet glow in the kitchen and the soft hum of an old floor heater filled the space. Her coat was still on the back of the chair. her shoes still by the door. The folder rested on the dining table, closed but not forgotten. It had weight now, not just physical, a kind of moral heaviness that made the room quieter than usual. She poured herself a glass of water, sat down and opened the folder again, slower this time, like turning the pages of someone else's confession. There was no denying what was in front of her. Private trips disguised as professional events, receipts for hotel stays that outpriced entire family vacations, flights on jets that didn't belong to the government, or the justice, or anything remotely accountable. Some of the documents were old, 3, 4 years. Others were recent enough to feel immediate. She spread them out in rows across the table. They looked like puzzle pieces at first, but slowly a picture was forming, one that didn't need dramatic music or accusations. Just attention. Still in work clothes, hair half undone, she moved to the couch and opened her laptop. The soft click of keys was the only sound in the room. Her browser filled with cases, congressional reports, archived ethics hearings. She searched the names of justices who had been scrutinized in the past. Almost all of them had been protected, buffered, sheltered by time or politics or both. She clicked through headlines. Impeachment inquiry fizzles amid party divisions. Ethics complaints dismissed due to lack of jurisdiction. Calls for reform misplaced and unnecessary, says Senate Chair. Each link felt like a door that had once opened and was later quietly shut. Her eyes scanned the margins of old PDFs, footnotes in law journals, forgotten editorials. There were people before her who had tried to raise the same questions. People with quieter names, lower profiles. And in most cases, their efforts dissolved before the public ever looked up. The weight of that history pressed down gently. She leaned back into the couch, the laptop still open on her knees. The screen's glow lit up her face, but her gaze had drifted. What if silence is the last thing we can afford? The thought wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It settled over her like a coat she'd worn before. The truth was, she didn't want this fight. No one sane would. She'd come to Congress to talk about working-class dignity, about housing, about climate, not to stand in the shadows of marble walls built to resist accountability. But the folder was real, and if no one else would speak about it, if those with more seniority, more safety, more distance wouldn't touch it, then maybe, just maybe, she had to. She closed the laptop, moved slowly back to the table, and began organizing the documents. Not for anyone else, yet, just for herself. She needed to know that if she was going to carry this forward, she wouldn't fumble the weight of it. Outside, the city was sleeping, but inside something ancient stirred. Not anger, not ambition. Something quieter, older, like a whisper that had waited generations for someone to finally pause and listen. She looked around her small apartment, the bookshelves packed with policy binders, the photographs from her Bronx district, a dried flower from her first election night still taped to the wall. She didn't feel brave or dramatic or even certain, just responsible. She gathered the papers into a neat pile and slid them back into the envelope. Then she stood, walked to her bedroom, and turned off the light. Not to forget, but to rest. Tomorrow she would wake up with the same question in her chest. If no one else will speak, who will? And she already knew the answer. The folder stayed in her bag the entire next day. It moved with her, from meetings to hearings, from quick hallway conversations to long walks between buildings, always there, resting quietly, waiting. No one asked about it, though some glanced at her a little longer than usual, as if sensing something unsaid pressing just behind her eyes. She answered questions, voted on amendments, smiled politely when expected, but a part of her mind remained fixed on those pages. By the time evening came, the Capitol had emptied out again. Most staff had gone home. The rotunda was still in cold, the kind of quiet that feels carved from stone. And yet AOC found herself walking the halls instead of leaving. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe distance, maybe clarity, or maybe just enough silence to hear herself think without the noise of everyone else's caution bleeding in. The marble echoed beneath her steps, soft but certain. Every footfall seemed to hang in the air a little too long, like a question that didn't want an answer. She passed portraits of men who had served and ruled and faded into history, their faces frozen in oil, their eyes too proud to look down. She paused in front of one, a justice from a century ago, and studied the curve of his painted mouth. Thought about how many things had been done quietly, and how many more had been quietly ignored. Outside one of the tall windows, the city blinked in silence. A row of street lamps cast long shadows across the stone steps below. She could see her reflection in the glass, tired, thoughtful, standing alone in a building that rarely welcomed troublemakers. She whispered, not to be dramatic, but because that was the only volume that felt honest in that moment. They want me to pretend I didn't see this, but pretending never fixed a damn thing. The words weren't angry, just steady, like truth walking without shoes. She stood there a while longer, watching her own stillness, as if waiting for some sign of approval or warning to appear in the face looking back at her. But it didn't. Just her, unchanged, except for the folder in her bag and the weight in her chest. Eventually, she turned and made her way back to her office. It was nearly midnight now. The door clicked closed behind her like punctuation. She moved without rushing, as if her body already knew the rhythm of what needed to happen next. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light over her papers. She pulled out the folder and laid it open once again, carefully spreading the contents like pieces of a fragile truth. Then she reached for a blank legal pad. No grand gestures, no press releases, just pen to paper. Her handwriting was deliberate, a little slower than usual. She knew every word might be examined, twisted, used against her, or reshaped into something she didn't mean. But she also knew that clarity could be louder than anger, and courage didn't always feel like fire. Sometimes it was just the act of beginning, quiet, unsure, but real. She wrote the title first, centered at the top. Motion to initiate articles of impeachment, judicial ethics and abuse of public trust. Then she kept going, through the night, through her doubts, through the long silence between each breath. The building remained still around her, unmoved, but something inside her had shifted. Not into certainty. There would be plenty of days ahead for questions, for conflict, for being called every name in the book. But for now, there was only the work. The first words were down, the rest would follow, and somewhere deep in the marble, the ghosts of old silence stirred. Not to stop her, but perhaps this time, to watch. The leak didn't come with thunder, no dramatic press conference, no grand reveal. Just a quiet ripple that spread too quickly to contain. By mid-morning, the whispers had turned into phone calls. By noon, her phone buzzed nonstop. Reporters, aides, policy staffers, she barely knew, suddenly calling with clipped voices, asking if it was true. Had she really filed it? Was it official? Was she serious? She didn't answer any of them. Not yet. The motion hadn't been scheduled for public release. But someone, maybe inside her own camp, maybe not, had let it slip. A few well-placed phrases in a Capitol newsletter were enough to light the match. Impeachment, Supreme Court, ethics violations. Those words didn't need help to travel. In the cafeteria, the room quieted slightly when she walked in. Not hostile, just paused, like everyone was waiting to see how loud she'd be about it. She wasn't. Instead, she grabbed a coffee, thanked the young staffer behind the counter, and returned to her office, calm on the outside. Inside, she could feel the pressure tightening, slowly but constantly, like air being pulled from a room she couldn't leave. It didn't take long before the invitation came. Not on paper, not by email. Just a knock at the door, and an aide with eyes that said it wasn't really an invitation. They met in a side room, one of those tucked-away lounges with leather chairs and stale air, where hard conversations go to stay quiet. 3 senior Democrats were already there when she entered. Longtime names, faces she'd shaken hands with at fundraisers and hearings. Today, their smiles were gone. They didn't waste time. "This isn't the moment for this," one said gently, though his tone left little room for softness. "You'll divide the party," said another, already rubbing his forehead. "You're going to lose us the center," added the third more directly. "Think long-term. Don't waste your capital. This isn't the hill to die on." They weren't shouting. They didn't have to. Their voices had weight, the kind carved from years of surviving political winters. They weren't trying to shame her. They were trying to protect something. The party, the institution, maybe even her, in a way that still saw her as a promising future rather than a current force. She listened. That was all she did. She let them speak. Let them layer reason and strategy like bricks meant to build a safer path. But in her chest, she felt something stir that had nothing to do with safety. When they finished, the room went still, expectant, waiting for her to nod, to retract, to say she'd thought it over. She didn't. She stood, thanked them for their time, and left without raising her voice. Outside, the hallway looked the same. Staffers hurried past, papers in hand, earbuds in ears. But something had changed. Word was out now. The motion existed. It was real. And no one, not even her party, was sure what to do with that. She returned to her office and closed the door quietly behind her. At her desk, the motion sat, freshly printed, still unsigned at the bottom. She looked at it for a long moment. No one said she had to submit it today. No deadline loomed. But time had shifted the moment she'd written the title. What had begun as a question had now become a choice. She picked up her pen, and without ceremony, she signed. Just her name. No speech, no headlines, just ink drying slowly in a room where the air still felt heavy, but a little more honest. Tomorrow would bring noise, maybe backlash, maybe worse. But tonight, for the first time in days, the pressure didn't feel suffocating. It felt clear, and it felt hers. The office had grown quiet again. After the hallway meetings, the closed-door warnings, and the sidelong glances that spoke more than words, there was, for a brief moment, stillness. AOC sat with her back straight, her pen idle in one hand, reading the same sentence of a housing bill 3 times without absorbing a word. Her thoughts kept drifting, not to what had already happened, but to what might come next. She was halfway through a cup of chamomile tea, not because she particularly enjoyed it, but because someone once told her it steadied the nerves. It didn't. Not really. But the warmth helped. There was a soft knock. Not the usual staff knock. This one was gentler, more measured. A pause, and then her aides stepped in with a look that already said too much. "Someone's here to see you. They said it's personal." She nodded once. Moments later, a man entered. Polished, composed, mid-50s, suit tailored so perfectly it barely moved when he walked. She recognized the face. He was never on the ballot, never on the record, but his name circled every major political dinner table in D.C. An advisor to one of the largest donors in the party, someone whose phone calls could rearrange priorities before breakfast. He smiled, but not wide enough to be warm. More like someone accustomed to entering rooms that weren't his and leaving them with something that was. "I'll be quick," he said, setting a thin leather folder on her desk without sitting down. "I'm here out of respect. Let's call it a courtesy." She didn't respond. Not yet. He opened the folder, revealing nothing sensitive. Just a list of proposed legislative partnerships, a few committee notes, and a donor outreach calendar for the next 2 quarters. "There's room to grow here," he said, tapping lightly on the page. "People want to see you rise. You've got something unique, and momentum like that, it can be protected." She looked at the folder, then at him. "Withdraw the motion," he said, voice smooth. "No statements, no drama. Let the press cycle cool down. The court survives intact. You get to keep your fire, and we," his hand gestured gently between them, "get to build forward. Together." Still, she said nothing, just watched him, expression unreadable. He continued, mistaking her quiet for receptiveness. "It doesn't have to be a loss. Think long-term. There are other battles, bigger ones. We want to help you choose the right ones." Her silence held, steady and deliberate. But inside, a different weather system churned. There was something about his tone, the ease with which he spoke of trading away principle as if it were just another chess piece, that made her stomach tighten. He wasn't threatening her, not directly. He didn't need to. The language of power was rarely loud. It lived in what was implied, in what would be quietly withheld later. He smiled again, gathering the folder. "No pressure, just something to consider." She nodded slightly, a polite acknowledgement, nothing more. He left without shaking her hand. When the door closed behind him, she remained still for a long moment. The office was warm, but she felt cold across her collarbone, like something had passed through her. Not quite a chill, but the trace of a door opening somewhere she wasn't meant to walk through. She stood, crossed the room, and opened the window just an inch. The air outside was sharp and real, and she welcomed it. In another world, maybe someone would have taken that offer, called it smart, strategic, forward-thinking. But she hadn't come here to be built. She'd come to build differently. The folder he left behind stayed on her desk for hours, unread. By midnight it was gone, recycled with the day's other quiet trash, and in the morning she would keep writing. Not because it was easy, but because she still believed that some truths didn't need permission. Only enough room to stand. It had been months since she'd walked those sidewalks in daylight without a microphone nearby. The Bronx didn't need fanfare. It recognized her in smaller ways. A nod from the fruit vendor, a glance from the teenager leaning on a bike, a quiet smile from someone who remembered her campaign before the headlines came. Alexandria hadn't come home to be seen. She came because her mind needed space that didn't echo back with strategy. The kind of space where no one handed her folders, no one weighed her words, and no one used silence to negotiate power. Her mother still lived in the same apartment above the bodega. The door was a little stiffer now. The hallway smelled faintly of bleach and old wood, but the comfort was immediate. Inside, the air carried warmth, rice simmering on the stove, a folded quilt draped over the couch, a small fan humming even though it wasn't that hot. Her mother hugged her with both arms and said nothing. She didn't need to. Some women knew how to speak without sound. Later that afternoon, they walked to the corner laundromat, not because they had to, just because it was a ritual neither of them had bothered to replace. The machine still made the same uneven hum. The detergent shelf was still half broken, and the little girl playing with a plastic dinosaur near the dryer reminded her of a version of herself she almost forgot she'd been. She sat with her mother by the window while a basket of clean clothes cooled in silence. No politics, no headlines. Just the rhythm of fabric being folded, one piece at a time. A woman walked past the machines, middle-aged Puerto Rican, the kind of face you don't forget even if you've never learned her name. She stopped, looked at AOC with eyes that didn't blink much, and said gently but firmly, "You walk like your spine is already made of stone." Then just as simply, she turned back to her dryer. No fanfare, no follow-up, just a gift wrapped in observation. AOC blinked once, unsure whether to smile or bow her head. Her mother, folding a towel, didn't even pause. She just said without looking up, "Let them try to move that." The sentence floated there for a while, between the rows of machines and the dust-lined corners, and settled somewhere inside her, quiet and firm. Later, as they walked back home, her mother finally spoke again. "You always had that look, even when you were 5, always thinking too far ahead. But lately you look heavier, not tired, just heavier." AOC nodded, not because she agreed or disagreed, but because there was no point hiding it here. "I'm carrying something," she admitted softly. Her mother stopped walking, turned toward her, and brushed a curl away from her face. "Good," she said. "Carry it like it's yours. That's the only way it won't crush you." That night after dinner, Alexandria stood in front of the small bathroom mirror, the same one that had hung crooked for 20 years. She studied herself. Not the face on news shows, not the voice in interviews, but the girl who used to practice speeches in this very room with a toothbrush as a mic. She didn't feel brave. She didn't feel reckless. Just aware. Aware that something had been set in motion, and that no matter what the morning brought, she wasn't turning back. Not because she was fearless, but because the people who raised her had taught her something softer and somehow stronger. That when you carry truth with both hands, you don't run from the weight. You learn how to hold it steady. The building looked the same that morning. Clean lines, polished floors, staffers moving briskly through the corridors like every other day. But AOC could feel it in the air. The kind of stillness that doesn't mean peace. The kind that comes just before something breaks open. She arrived earlier than usual. No entourage. Just her and the folder. No one stopped her on the walk from the entrance to the clerk's desk, though a few eyes followed. She could sense whispers brushing past her shoulder, invisible but not unfelt. She carried the motion in her hand like it didn't weigh anything. But it did. Not just the paper, barely a few ounces, but the meaning behind every word. Months of quiet research, weeks of sleepless nights, the slow ache of knowing something and choosing not to walk away from it. It was all there, held together by a single staple, and her name on the last page. The clerk looked up as she approached, familiar but surprised. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. He just reached for the folder and time-stamped it with a mechanical thud that echoed louder in her chest than she expected. And just like that, it was done. The motion was filed. She turned without ceremony, walked back through the same corridor, heart steady but not still. Every step felt both ordinary and irreversible. She didn't check her phone, though it had already begun to vibrate. The news broke within minutes. First a tweet, then a headline, then 5, then 20. Within the hour, her name was everywhere, not just in political threads, but on morning talk shows, international news tickers, late-night satire promos. AOC moves to impeach Supreme Court justice over ethics scandal. Reckless or righteous? Ocasio-Cortez breaks party line in historic motion. Career suicide or political genius? Radical left challenges the judiciary. The word radical appeared more times than she could count. So did reckless, irresponsible, alone. She sat at her desk, watching the reactions unfold. Clips of her floor speeches were repackaged and rehashed. Some analysts said it was performative. Others said it was courageous. A few leaned in with admiration, but more leaned out, unsure how close they wanted to stand to someone willing to light a match in a room full of old wood. Her phone filled with messages, some supportive, others careful, and a few, familiar numbers, quietly distanced themselves without saying so. But she wasn't surprised. What did surprise her, though, was how calm she felt. Not triumphant, not vindicated, just clear. She remembered something her father once told her when she was barely 12, standing on a step stool to speak at a school event. She'd been nervous, stumbling through the opening. Afterward, he'd bent down beside her and said, "If your voice shakes, it just means the truth got there first." Her voice hadn't shaken today. She turned her phone on silent and leaned back in her chair. Through the window, she could see the Capitol dome rising behind a veil of thin clouds. It looked untouchable from a distance, but she had walked its corridors, sat in its rooms, watched people build shields around power and call it tradition. And now her motion, just a few paragraphs, a few hard facts, was drifting through that very system like a question no one wanted to hear out loud. Let them call it reckless. Let them call it radical. The motion was real. The facts were real. And whether it passed or failed, it was no longer buried. For the first time, someone had said it plainly, on the record, for the world to see. That was the beginning. And beginnings always make noise. It started slowly. A few angry emails. A voicemail or two that ended with heavy breathing instead of words. Her staff flagged them, noted the patterns, reassured her it was normal. Politics came with noise. Not everyone would agree. She'd heard that before, many times. And truthfully, it didn't bother her. Not at first. She had skin thickened by years of criticism, sharpened by the knowledge that speaking up often meant standing alone. But within 48 hours of filing the motion, the tone changed. Her office inbox filled with threats. Not arguments, not critiques, just raw fury. Anonymous names, scrambled addresses, messages written in all caps, some biblical in tone, others laced with graphic detail. Her staff filtered what they could, but some slipped through. Some were forwarded to Capitol Police. Still, the air felt different, closer, heavier. Then her home address was posted online. She found out from a friend before she saw it herself. A quiet text, no punctuation. "It's on Twitter. The apartment. Delete the photos you tagged." She scrolled anyway. A photo of her building, the cross streets, even the name of the coffee shop across the road. Shared, liked, quoted. One comment said someone should pay her a visit. That night she slept on the couch in her office. Not because she wanted to, but because she needed the walls to feel closer. The building didn't feel safer, but it felt familiar. And sometimes in this line of work, that was the closest thing to protection. Her staff urged her to consider outside security. They spoke in soft tones, as if volume could dilute reality. She nodded, but she didn't answer. Part of her didn't want to make the threat real by reacting. Another part of her already knew what came next. The brick came on a Thursday. It hit the side window of her local office just after midnight. No note, no message, just the sound. Glass giving way in a clean, sudden shatter, and the wind rushing in behind it. She wasn't there, but the footage was clear. A person in a hoodie, face turned from the camera, disappearing into the dark like a question never meant to be answered. She watched the video twice, then closed her laptop and said nothing. The next day, a package arrived without a return address. The envelope inside was sealed. No bomb, no powder, no drama, just a single printed page, folded neatly and 6 words in the center. "You're next. Choose wisely. Clock's ticking." She stared at it for a long time. Not afraid. Not exactly. It was something quieter than fear. A kind of weight that settled in the ribs, not sharp but steady. A pressure that made her breathing more careful, more measured. She tucked the note back into the envelope and passed it to security. "Standard procedure," they said. "Nothing to trace. Keep a record. Stay alert." But none of that changed how it felt. That night, she sat by her office window, now reinforced, and looked out over the Capitol dome. The city sparkled below her, streetlights stretching like constellations across the grid. It was beautiful, in that cold, untouchable way DC often was. She sipped tea with both hands, letting the heat anchor her. The motion hadn't even reached the floor yet, and already the silence she had broken was trying to find new ways to silence her back. But she didn't feel like retreating. There's a moment, she realized, when fear no longer works the way it's supposed to, when it arrives too late, after the choice has already been made. And in that moment, what's left isn't panic. It's resolve. Thin, quiet, unshakable. It wasn't sudden, not really. More like a slow unraveling. A quiet shift in tone, in eye contact, in the way hallway conversations paused when she entered. No one raised their voice. No one stormed out. But things, subtle, human things, began to bend. It started with scheduling. A calendar invite accidentally left her out. A draft statement that softened her language without asking. A message from a junior staffer who respectfully asked to work remotely for a little while. By midweek, 2 of her senior aides asked for a meeting. They were calm, careful, the kind of careful that came not from anger but uncertainty. One said they were overextended. The other said she needed space to reflect. Neither used the word resign, but the distance in their voices filled in the rest. AOC nodded, thanked them, told them she understood. She did understand. They hadn't signed up for this. Not exactly. They came to work on policy, to shift the narrative, to advocate for justice through language and legislation. What they hadn't expected was to end up in the eye of a storm that no longer played by rules. The emails, the threats, the headlines. The sense that the walls were tightening faster than the cause could widen. Later that evening, she returned to her office alone. The lights were already dim. A cup of tea, long gone cold, sat by her window. She didn't turn it on again. She locked the door, sat at her desk, and opened her laptop. Not to check the news, not to finish edits, just to let the thought run its course. She opened a new document, typed her name at the top. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Letter of resignation. The words surprised her as they appeared. There was something strangely mechanical about them, as if her hands moved before her mind did. She stared at the blinking cursor, the way it waited for her to commit. She wrote the first version like a confession. "It's clear the time has come," it began, polite, measured, distant. A paragraph later, she deleted it. The second letter was angrier. It named names, described the silence she had been met with, called out the donors, the party leaders, the institutions too rigid to bend. But that one didn't make it to the end either. She stopped midway through and closed the tab. The third was short, only a sentence. "This fight no longer belongs to me." She stared at it longer than she'd stared at the others. Something about its simplicity felt close to honest. Not because it was true, but because she'd almost started believing it could be. Almost. And then she highlighted the sentence. Pressed delete. The screen went blank. Just the soft glow in a dark room and the hum of capital ventilation in the background. She leaned back in her chair and breathed out slowly. She didn't need a resignation letter. Not because she felt invincible. She didn't. But because stepping away didn't feel like relief. It felt like unfinished work. She stood, stretched the stiffness from her shoulders, and walked to the window. The Capitol dome was quiet again, but she'd stopped expecting it to answer her back. Her voice, when it came, wasn't loud. Just steady, something between a memory and a decision. They were never afraid of the lie. They were afraid of the first person to say it out loud. She whispered it into the glass, not expecting it to echo. But it stayed there, in the room with her, settling like truth does, soft, unshakable, and impossible to ignore. Outside, the lights of the city blinked on, one by one, as if waiting for what came next. The night didn't feel dramatic. It felt quiet, soft edges, dim light, the kind of quiet that crept in slowly and stayed long after the dishes were done. The notifications were silenced, and the outside world had turned its attention elsewhere. Alexandria sat cross-legged on the living room floor, back against the couch, a blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders. The apartment was mostly dark, just a warm lamp by the bookshelf casting its small circle of comfort across the hardwood. Her phone sat face down on the rug beside her, buzzing every few minutes. Texts, alerts, someone tagging her in something she wasn't ready to look at yet. The motion was filed. The media frenzy had boiled over. The threats were documented and reported. Her staff had stepped back. Everything that could be done had been done. For now. And yet she couldn't sleep. Not because she was afraid. She'd already passed that phase. This was something else. A hum beneath the skin. A restlessness that didn't want attention, just release. Without really planning to, she reached for her phone and opened the Instagram app. Her finger hovered over the Go Live button. It had been months since she used it. Not for policy, not for press, not for firebrand moments, just for herself. A voice without a script. She hit the button. The screen blinked once, twice, then settled into the live frame. Her face appeared softly in the light. The viewer count started at 1, then 5, then 27. She didn't wait for more. "Hi," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I wasn't planning on talking tonight, but here we are." She paused, not to gather thoughts, but because she wanted her words to come from the right place. "I've been thinking a lot about my dad lately," she continued, her voice slow, deliberate. "He passed when I was 19. I remember when I got my first paycheck after he died, I was waitressing. It wasn't much. I brought it home and stared at it like it was both a gift and an insult. A reminder that from now on, I was the one who had to hold things together." She smiled faintly, not for the camera, just at the memory. "And I remember how different everything felt after that. The way people spoke to me, the way I looked at bills, the way responsibility wrapped itself around my spine and stayed there." The viewer count ticked past 1,000. She didn't seem to notice. "When people call me loud," she said, "I think about that time, about how I used to think being heard meant being the loudest voice in the room. But it's not. It's not about volume. It's about weight, about whether what you're saying lands somewhere real." Her voice wavered slightly but never lost its shape. "I didn't file that motion because I thought it would be easy or popular. I did it because I saw something I couldn't unsee. Because silence in the face of power isn't neutrality. It's permission." She glanced down, adjusted the phone slightly, then looked back up. "I'm not asking anyone to agree with me. I'm just asking, when did we start treating accountability like an attack?" The chat feed filled with hearts, with comments like, "Thank you," "We see you," and "Don't stop." "I'm tired too," she added gently. "But tired doesn't mean done. It just means I need to remember why I started." A moment passed. She let the silence stretch, not because she was done, but because it felt right. "I'll let you rest now," she whispered, more to the audience than to herself. "Thanks for letting me speak without shouting." She ended the stream, set the phone aside, and in the soft quiet that returned, she felt something loosen, not her convictions, but the ache of carrying them alone. For once, it felt like the echo didn't just bounce back. It reached someone. She didn't expect anyone to stay up. It was past midnight when she ended the live stream, and the city outside her window had already surrendered to sleep. From her apartment, the street lamps cast quiet shadows on empty sidewalks, and for a while the silence after she signed off felt like the first full breath she'd taken in days. She didn't check the numbers, didn't reread the comments. She closed her phone and went to bed with no plan other than rest. But the world didn't sleep like she did. Somewhere between 2 a.m. and dawn, the video found its rhythm. It moved the way truth sometimes does, quietly, without permission. It passed between nurses in hospital break rooms, between tired parents scrolling in the dark, between law students pulling all-nighters, wondering if the Constitution still had room for morality. By sunrise, it had crossed 10 million views. Her phone buzzed with a different energy now, not from cable news or opportunists, but from people she didn't know, from corners of the country she'd never been to. Messages from teachers, night shift workers, small-town mayors. And then there was the comment, the one that stayed with her longer than all the rest. A simple sentence beneath the video, posted at 3:17 a.m. My daughter asked if judges are above the law. I didn't know what to say. Now I do. She read it 3 times before letting the weight of it land. Not because it was complex, but because it was the kind of truth that made things still. The kind that reminded her why words, when spoken plainly, can ripple wider than shouting ever could. By mid-morning, the tone around her had started to shift. The usual headlines weren't gone, but they'd softened. Editorial boards that had once used phrases like reckless misstep now wondered aloud if perhaps it was time for new ethical standards. Cable anchors, once skeptical, played clips from the live stream in full, not just sound bites, with quiet in their voices instead of cynicism. A progressive paper called her motion a necessary discomfort. A center-right columnist referred to her stand as stubborn but sincere. And in a Sunday op-ed buried at the bottom of a national paper, one line stood out. She didn't dismantle the institution. She reminded us it was already cracked. She sat in her office rereading the article, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold hours ago. Staff filtered in and out quietly, not out of fear, but something closer to care. The mood had changed. Not celebratory, not yet, but steady. And steadiness in this town was a kind of revolution. She replied to the comment from that mother, just a few words typed with care. Thank you. Tell your daughter she asked the right question. Then she closed her laptop and leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. The city beyond the window was awake now. Cars moving, conversations beginning, coffee shops opening one cautious cup at a time. And somewhere in that movement, something else had shifted too. Not the system, not yet, but the air around it. People had started to talk differently, not louder, just clearer. And in a place built to outwait storms, sometimes clarity was more dangerous than thunder. She didn't smile, not exactly, but something in her face softened. For the first time in days, she no longer felt like she was pushing uphill alone. The story had left the building. It belonged to the country now. The change didn't come in a wave. It came in a quiet series of ripples, small, steady, undeniable. It began with a letter from a group of high school civics teachers in Pennsylvania, typed, signed by hand, sent through the mail like it was still 1995. The language was careful but honest. They thanked her not for being right, but for being willing. Our students are watching, it read, and they needed to see that someone still believes integrity has weight. Then came the veterans. A group out of Illinois, retired officers who had served across 6 decades in different wars under different presidents. Their statement was published in a local paper, and it didn't go viral at first, but its final line did. We defended the Constitution. We didn't expect someone her age would have to remind the rest of them what it means. Legal scholars followed, some more cautiously than others. A few former judges, quiet names with long careers, spoke up for the first time in years, not to choose sides, but to ask questions out loud that too many had whispered. Is a robe a shield or a responsibility? One essay posed, and if the law does not examine itself, what hope is there for the governed? Each voice didn't roar, but together they built something louder than outrage: legitimacy. In her office, AOC read the statements as they came in. Not obsessively, not for validation, but the way someone listens to a heartbeat after days of uncertainty. She didn't frame them. She didn't post screenshots. She printed them quietly one by one and pinned them on a corkboard behind her desk. No headline, no explanation. Just reminders that she wasn't imagining it, that something was shifting. The real moment, though, the one that stayed with her, arrived in a white envelope, hand addressed in careful cursive. No return address, no official seal, just a stamp, slightly off-center, and a letter folded neatly inside. It read, "You didn't speak for all of us. You spoke when all of us couldn't." That was it. No name, no city, no details. Just that one line, as clean and heavy as truth sometimes is. She read it once, then again, then folded it and placed it in the drawer to her right, the one that held things she didn't quite know where to keep but couldn't throw away either. Outside, the Capitol looked the same, but inside she could feel it, the soft fracture in the stone, the hairline crack in the wall that had for so long refused to bend. It wasn't collapse, it wasn't victory, but it was movement, and sometimes that was enough to begin again. When her staff returned from lunch, they found her standing at the corkboard, adding another paper to the growing collage. One of them smiled but didn't say anything. They didn't need to, because something unspoken had begun to fill the room. Not triumph, but steadiness, not noise, but clarity. And in a city built on the illusion of immovable structures, even the smallest shift meant the foundation was no longer untouched. She sat back down, reopened her draft for the floor speech, and typed the next paragraph with a little more certainty in her fingertips. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't bracing for backlash. She was preparing for momentum. And somewhere behind the walls, cracked, not broken, the truth was beginning to echo. The email came late the night before, brief, procedural, intentionally cold. The House Ethics Committee had agreed to allow a public hearing. No cameras inside the chamber, but the transcript would be released. It would be on record. That was enough. Not an invitation, not a vote of confidence, just permission. And even that came with the unspoken tone of resignation, as if they were indulging a process no one believed would go anywhere. The morning air was crisp as AOC walked across the Capitol grounds. She wasn't wearing anything new. No bold color, no attention-seeking detail. A simple suit, hair pulled back, no talking points in her hand. Just the motion itself, the evidence, and a silence that felt less like fear now and more like focus. Inside, the building held a different kind of quiet. Not the stillness of calm, but the weight of people waiting for something they didn't want to witness. Some of the committee members were already seated when she entered, papers in front of them, expressions blank, eyes flickering from her to the folder in her hands. Others avoided eye contact altogether. The room smelled faintly of paper and wood polish, the way government rooms often do. Everything felt clean, formal, and vaguely uncomfortable. She walked with a slow, even pace down the central aisle, eyes straight ahead. No hesitation, no flinch. The sound of her shoes against the tile echoed more than she expected. It made the room feel both bigger and smaller than it was. She reached the table at the front and sat. She didn't lean in. She didn't shuffle her notes. She simply placed the folder in front of her and waited. The chair of the committee, a senior congressman whose voice usually carried a tone of forced gravitas, cleared his throat. "Representative Ocasio-Cortez, you've requested this hearing to formally present the basis of your motion. You may proceed." No one in the room moved. Not a cough, not a whisper. She opened the folder with care, looked up, and then, still calm, still steady, she began to speak. Not loudly, not theatrically, but with the kind of quiet that made people lean forward instead of away. Every sentence was measured, every claim paired with a document. She walked them through it, not just the what, but the why. Not just the travel logs and the financial disclosures, but the principles behind them, the expectation of neutrality, the trust that underpins a system too often shielded by ritual, the difference between law and power, and why the former should never be quietly bought. No one interrupted her. Some scribbled notes. Others kept their hands folded, as if waiting for her to say something wrong. But she didn't. She wasn't there to win them over. She was there to put the truth on the table, softly, clearly, with enough gravity to be undeniable. And in that room, thick with tension and unspoken discomfort, something began to shift. Not dramatically, not immediately, but enough that no one could say afterward they hadn't felt it. Because sometimes the most disarming thing in a lion's den is the one person who walks in without pretending to roar. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't adjust the mic. She simply began, as though this were not a stage but a continuation of the same conversations she'd been having quietly for years. "I'm not attacking the court," she said, her voice calm but unshakably present. "I'm asking who the court answers to." A few pens paused mid-note. No protest, no objection. Just the kind of stillness that comes when a room realizes it is about to be asked to listen. Truly listen. She lifted a slim binder, opened it without drama, and placed one page gently on the table. "This is a docket entry from June," she continued. "That same week, a private plane belonging to a major litigant landed here." Another paper. "This is a receipt from a retreat that took place off the books. 2 justices in attendance. One of them ruled in favor of the host in a case that reshaped environmental protections. There was no recusal." She didn't look up to gauge reaction. She didn't need to. Page by page, she unfolded a quiet storm, a trail of luxury gifts, invitations cloaked as educational retreats, rulings issued within days of off-the-record meetings. She never raised her voice. If anything, it softened, drawing the room closer, one layer at a time. Her fingers traced a timeline on a single sheet as she spoke, not accusatory, but steady. When precedent breaks and when power is wielded with no transparency, the public is left to wonder whether justice is something being practiced or something being purchased. Still, no interruption. Not from the chair, not from the counsel, not even from those who had entered the room prepared to discredit her. She paused only once, to let the silence settle before the final reveal. Then she reached for the last folder. Thinner, personal. "This letter isn't from a watchdog organization or a law professor. It's from a mother in Des Moines. Her daughter asked why the law only seems to follow some people, and the only answer she could give was, because that's how it's always been." She let the weight of that sentence breathe in the air between them. "I'm not here because I hate the system. I'm here because I love what it promises to be." That was it. She didn't close with theatrics. She didn't dramatize her exit. She simply placed her final document down, closed her binder, and sat back. Not with relief, but with clarity. She had said what needed to be said. And though no one moved, something in the atmosphere had changed. Not because she had shattered the room with volume, but because she had walked straight through it, with truth and nothing else. The hearing room had emptied, but the air still held the quiet hum of something unfinished. AOC gathered her notes slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of a desire to absorb the stillness after the storm. Behind her, staffers murmured, journalists packed up cords and cameras, and the final flashes faded. She thought she was alone. But as she moved toward the exit, a voice stopped her. Low, measured, almost careful. "I won't defend you," it said. She turned. A familiar face, gray-templed, tailored, the kind of presence more often seen behind closed doors than at microphones. A senior conservative senator, one who had never spoken more than a nod to her in years. He didn't smile. He didn't soften. "But I won't forget you either." She didn't answer, not immediately. She just looked at him, not with defiance, not with gratitude, but with something quieter, a knowing, a recognition that truth, once said aloud, has a strange way of finding its own echoes. He gave a short nod, then walked away, disappearing into the corridor like a man retreating into a world he wasn't quite sure how to explain anymore. That night she didn't turn on the news. She curled up on her couch in silence. But the world outside didn't stay still. Within hours, the video of her testimony hit 1 million views. By morning, it was trending globally. People weren't just sharing it, they were quoting it. A line here, a pause there. Teachers projected it in classrooms. Law students dissected it like scripture. A retired judge wrote an op-ed titled, "She Didn't Shout, She Showed Us." For 2 days straight, hashtag who do they answer to sat at the top of every trending chart. It wasn't that she had dismantled anyone. It was that she dared to ask the question no one else had wanted on record. And somehow that quiet defiance resonated louder than all the shouting she had ever refused to do. She didn't go on a media tour, didn't give interviews. She let the silence speak. But in her notebook that night, under the date, she wrote one line. Sometimes the walls don't crumble when you hit them. Sometimes they shift when someone dares to name them. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to sleep. Not because she felt safe, but because she had finally said what needed to be said. And the world had, at last, chosen to listen. It began like most storms these days, quietly. A cropped image, a video with her voice, except it wasn't. A headline that sounded plausible if you didn't know her. A whisper disguised as a breaking alert. By noon, her name was plastered across corners of the internet that had never cared to pronounce it correctly. AOC caught in foreign collusion. Impeachment push based on fabricated files. Leaked video shows her admitting it was all staged. She sat in her office, an inbox filling with confused subject lines. Is this true? Please clarify. Tell me you didn't. How could you? One clip in particular went viral. A deep fake of her in what looked like a private room, saying words she had never uttered. Her face moved just enough. Her voice was close enough. To the untrained eye, it looked real. That was the point. She didn't panic. Not this time. Not after everything. Instead, she scrolled in silence. She watched how quickly the lie moved. How easily truth became an afterthought in the firestorm of clicks. The old instincts crept in. That familiar ache in her chest. That flicker of wondering whether it was worth it. This constant uphill walk through mud designed to swallow people who looked like her. But then came the quiet replies. At first a few, then thousands. A retired teacher posted side-by-side screenshots. This isn't even the same mole. I taught media literacy for 28 years. You don't erase the truth with Photoshop. A young coder dissected the video frame by frame and uploaded a breakdown titled, "Here's how you can tell they're lying." Mothers began reposting her original live stream with the hashtag I heard her myself. And something rare happened. The smear didn't land. Not the way it used to. Not the way they counted on. Because this time people remembered the receipts. They remembered the stillness in her voice when she'd said, "I'm not here to burn down institutions. I'm here to ask who they serve." They remembered how she'd pulled up documents, not slogans. Dates, not drama. Questions, not accusations. And somewhere in the noise, the orchestrators of the campaign seemed to realize they'd miscalculated. She wasn't just a symbol anymore. She was a story too many had chosen to keep. Still, the damage wasn't nothing. Her mother called in tears. A cousin's job interview got derailed. A childhood friend was harassed for defending her on Facebook. But AOC didn't log off. She posted a single sentence that evening. No hashtags, no fanfare. They tried to unmake me with a voice that wasn't mine, but the people knew the sound. And slowly the tide turned, not just back to her, but forward, towards something steadier. A small-town judge published an open letter. "We teach our students to document sources." Turns out she did too. A pastor quoted her in a Sunday sermon. A former Capitol officer quietly reached out. "I'm not political, but I saw the real clip, and I just wanted to say, you held that room with grace." She walked through the next week without armor, but not without weight. And that, she realized, was a kind of power too. They could fake her face, twist her tone, rewrite her sentences. But what they couldn't do, what they had never figured out, was how to erase what had already landed in people's hearts. And when something honest lives there long enough, even a lie has nowhere left to go. The protests didn't begin with her name on signs. That's how she knew something had shifted. They didn't chant for her or even about her. They chanted about justice and about the laws meant to hold it accountable. At first it was small. A group of second-year law students stood outside a courthouse in Boston, holding hand-lettered placards that read, "No bench above scrutiny." It was quiet, no media, no speeches, just presence. But the image traveled. By the next weekend, it was Philadelphia, then Madison, then Sacramento. Not marches of outrage, but of intention. People gathered with notebooks, printouts, copies of the Constitution, highlighted in neon. One woman brought a folding table and offered coffee to passers-by. On a paper taped to the front, it read, "Ask me why judges don't have a code of ethics. I dare you." AOC didn't claim the moment. She watched it, quietly, and she knew better than to step in and center herself in something that had outgrown her name. That was the whole point. Still, she couldn't help but feel a kind of ache, soft but certain, when a clip surfaced of a small town hall in Kansas. A woman with silver hair, voice shaking just slightly, stood up and said, "My granddaughter asked me if truth still mattered in this country, and for a while I didn't know how to answer. But I think I do now. It starts here." The room clapped, not for the woman but for the courage behind the sentence. Then came the lawyers. They weren't famous, not pundits, not flashy, but they understood something that needed to be said plainly. Justices, despite their titles, were still public servants. And public servants needed standards. They called themselves the Gavel Project, a nod to authority, a challenge to silence. Their first paper circulated quietly, an open letter to Congress with footnotes, citations, and a firm request for a Judicial Ethics Reform Act. What surprised even AOC wasn't the content, but the tone, measured, composed, and unshakably grounded. "This is not a political crisis," they wrote. "This is a civic one, and civic crises demand clarity." The letter made its way to inboxes across the Hill. Some ignored it, some mocked it, but others, quietly, began to forward it. In Queens, AOC walked into a local community center, expecting the usual turnout of 20, maybe 30 constituents. Instead, the room was full, standing room only. A man in his 70s leaned on a cane by the door and said with a shrug, "Figured it was time." Someone handed her a notebook and a pen. "Can we make a list," they asked, "of what comes next?" Not what comes for her, not what the backlash will be, but what comes next. There, in that overheated room, beneath flickering fluorescent lights and the smell of cafeteria coffee, a different kind of electricity stirred. People didn't want spectacle. They wanted steps. They wanted to build what they were told couldn't be built, not by rage, but by return. Return to the idea that power is not meant to be protected, but questioned. That accountability isn't punishment, it's a promise. Later that evening, alone in her apartment, AOC read through dozens of handwritten notes collected from the town hall. One in particular stopped her breath. "You reminded us that courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stays long enough for the truth to find its echo." She folded the note carefully, slipped it into a drawer beside her bed. Then, like always, she went to sleep with tomorrow waiting. But this time, the weight in her chest felt just a little lighter. Not because the fight was over, but because it no longer belonged to her alone. It wasn't flashy, no grand speech, no red carpet of reform, just a quiet submission of a bill, 14 pages long, single-spaced, written not to impress but to clarify, the Judicial Transparency Act. It didn't seek to shake the pillars of power. It didn't rewrite the Constitution or call for sweeping upheaval. It asked for three things: financial disclosures updated annually, recusal standards clearly defined, and a public-facing ethics board for justices. Modest, but powerful. Some laughed, some rolled their eyes. "AOC's paper protest," one pundit tweeted, but others paused. Because the bill didn't shout, it pointed, directly and without drama. She released a quiet video to explain it. No fanfare, no music, just her, seated in a plain chair by a bookshelf. "This bill isn't about revenge, it's about repair." The next day, a small surprise arrived. A Republican from Maine added his name as co-sponsor, then another from Ohio, then one from Utah. No interviews, no statements, just three signatures that told a different story. The House floor didn't erupt. It leaned in. Even those who wouldn't support the bill began referencing it. Even those who opposed it began modifying their rhetoric. Because now there was a baseline, a proposal, something real to argue against. Back home in Queens, a middle school civics teacher printed the bill for her 8th grade class. This, she told them, is how change tries to walk before it runs. Of course, the larger motion, the attempt to open formal impeachment hearings, failed. The votes weren't there. It wasn't even close. And yet, it didn't feel like a loss. Because the hearings, now archived and spliced into shareable clips, had reached places even C-SPAN never dreamed of. Senior centers in Michigan, book clubs in Georgia, barber shops in Arizona. The words weren't always understood in their full legal weight, but the why that landed, and the faces behind the votes, people remembered those too. AOC walked the Capitol halls differently after that week, not triumphant, not vindicated, but steadied. She would pass colleagues and notice a change in posture, not warmer necessarily, but more measured. The same ones who once dismissed her now took a beat before responding. That beat said everything. Later that month, at a quiet bridge in D.C., she met with one of the Republican co-signers. No press, just coffee and a shared bench looking over the Potomac. He looked out at the water and said, without turning to her, "We're not on the same team, but the field's on fire. Someone had to bring water." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The bill would face hurdles. The court wouldn't change overnight, but a question had been planted. Who watches the highest bench in the land? And now that question had company, not mobs, not headlines, but people watching. By month's end, 2 more ethics reform proposals were floated by separate offices. Editorial boards began asking pointed questions. One even used her phrase, "repair, not revenge," as a headline. And somewhere in the middle of all this, a veteran mailed her a folded American flag with a note tucked inside. "I took an oath years ago. Didn't expect to hear it echoed from a voice like yours. But I'm glad I lived long enough to see it." She kept that flag, didn't frame it, didn't post about it, just folded it again, neatly, and placed it in her office drawer. The one with the original draft of the bill, still marked with smudged ink and 3 coffee stains. Not a revolution, but a record. Not an ending, but a bridge. The mail tray was full again. Stacks of envelopes in every shape and shade, some crisp and typed, others bent and smudged, ink faded by rain or rushed handwriting. Most didn't come with a return address. Many were just signed with a first name. A few had no name at all. At first, she tried to open each one carefully, a letter opener slicing the top edge like a ritual. But soon she just used her fingers, pulling paper free like she was unfolding small windows into a country she rarely got to see. One came from a night shift nurse in Indiana. She wrote by hand on hospital notepaper, the corners dotted with old coffee rings. "I watched your testimony from the break room. I'd never seen anyone look so calm while shaking the ground under them. Thank you for not letting them scare you." Another came from a retired grandfather in Montana. His script was shaky but neat. "I fought in Korea. Came back to a country that didn't want to hear what we'd seen. But last week I watched you speak, and for the first time in years I felt heard." A janitor from a courthouse in Missouri sent a postcard. No message, just a single word on the back. Finally, a law student wrote from an overstuffed dorm in New Jersey. She sent 3 pages, double-sided, annotated like a case file. At the end she wrote, "This week I almost changed majors. Then I saw you ask who the court answers to, and I remembered why I started." She stacked each one on her desk, reordering them without knowing why. Some she clipped together. Others she pressed between pages of books she was still rereading from college. One she pinned above her lamp. It simply said, "I'm 67, never voted for you. Still won't. But I taught civics for 40 years, and I know courage when I see it." In the quiet of her office, she read these not like a public figure, but like a daughter, a neighbor, a citizen trying to make sense of a moment she hadn't asked for, but refused to run from. These weren't endorsements, they were echoes. She didn't speak about them publicly, didn't hold them up at press conferences or post them online. These letters weren't props, they were proof. Proof that something had broken open, gently, insistently, beyond the chambers of Congress or the shouting halls of cable news. It was in the way a veteran's handwriting trembled but stayed firm. In the way a young teacher wrote, "My students asked me who holds power accountable. I showed them your clip." In the way a woman from El Paso simply wrote, "We carry your calm like a lantern." These words didn't change legislation, but they changed her breath. They softened the bruises from weeks of being accused, mocked, distorted, and they reminded her, this wasn't about her. It never had been. In the hallway outside her office, a staffer noticed that she now paused more often near the wall where portraits of past House members hung. Not out of pride, but out of a quiet question she seemed to ask herself, who gets remembered for truth? Not just tenure? That evening, as the building thinned and lights dimmed, she stayed behind. The pile of letters beside her, one hand resting on them lightly as if to feel their warmth, their weight. She didn't need to respond to each. They weren't looking for replies. They were looking for endurance, and she would offer it. In the months to come, she'd walk into hearings, town halls, interviews, and carry the words stitched inside her like armor made of whispers, not to shout louder, but to hold steady. Because now she knew, what they feared most wasn't the volume of her voice. It was the number of people who quietly nodded when she spoke. The morning light spilled gently over the marble, softening every sharp line of the courthouse. AOC moved quietly through the plaza, her steps measured, unhurried. Not because there wasn't urgency, but because sometimes dignity is its own kind of resistance. She didn't carry a statement, no entourage, no podium waiting. Just a folder tucked under her arm and the weight of recent weeks resting across her shoulders like an invisible shawl. Near the steps, she noticed a small cluster of people. A girl no older than 7 stood beside her mother. Her coat was too big, sleeves swallowing her hands, but what she held gripped AOC more than any headline ever had. A piece of cardboard slightly bent, scrawled in blue marker, "Truth has no title." The girl didn't say anything. She just looked at her, wide-eyed, unblinking, brave. AOC stopped just for a second, nodded, and then kept walking. Not for a camera, not for applause. But because she understood now, what walked beside her wasn't a crowd. It was clarity. And what lay ahead wasn't just policy. It was the path where truth didn't need permission to show up. It simply needed someone to keep walking. The cafe was nearly empty. Just the soft hum of an espresso machine and the occasional clink of a spoon on ceramic. AOC sat by the window, coat draped over the back of her chair, journal open before her. Her pen moved slowly, not for show, not for anyone else, just her own thoughts settling after the storm. No cameras, no spotlight, just space to breathe. Outside, people passed without noticing her, and maybe that was a kind of peace too. The absence of spectacle, the quiet dignity of being simply present. She wrote carefully, deliberately. They didn't cheer, but they heard, and maybe that's louder than applause. She paused, let the ink dry, then closed the journal and looked out at the street where nothing seemed different, though everything had shifted. The legacy wasn't etched in stone or shouted from podiums. It was softer than that, threaded into a little girl's sign, a veteran's letter, a student's first question, and as her voice returns one last time, quiet but certain, it says, "They called it reckless, but history often starts that way. The cup is empty, but the table remains, and so does the resolve." This story reminds us that impact doesn't always announce itself with noise. Sometimes change begins in quiet places, an unanswered question, a midnight live stream, a handwritten letter. AOC didn't aim to dismantle for the sake of defiance. She sought to ask who we allow to stand above accountability, and why. Her journey wasn't about personal victory, but about awakening public memory and responsibility. The most striking part is how her calm became its own form of resistance, proof that strength can be soft, and truth can echo without shouting. In a world where attention is often mistaken for influence, this narrative gently flips that idea. Legacy, as it turns out, doesn't need applause. It needs honesty, persistence, and a willingness to be misunderstood until time catches up. What about you? Have you ever stayed silent when something felt wrong, thinking your voice wouldn't matter? What would it take for you to speak, even if no one claps? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.